This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Cosmic Spectrum, and if you're new here, I used to be a freelance illustrator slash comic artist for a while, and recently I am taking a more independent route and developing my comic series, which I am just about to start executing. So in this video, I will show you guys some recent visual development stuff that I did from my comic. As some of you may know, I have been working on it for a very long time, so I have some pretty solid ideas of what my characters already look like. So at this point, most of the visual development consists of style testing, just to tweak the approach and costume design, as well as like any character designs that are still missing for the secondary characters and background people. But in this particular video, I'm tackling the dress design for one of my main characters because she appears in this old-fashioned dress in the prologue, which I am about to start executing, which is why I decided to hammer down the dress design first. So I am just gonna share the time-lapse version of, or like the quick time-lapse version of the digital recording. I know that some of you guys are probably used to me using a different type of recording, like real-time chunks and whatnot. That's what I've been doing for a while now, but I decided to stick to this method of showing you guys my process for this particular video because I think it's more interesting to see the entirety of the process, and obviously the video would be much too long if I just left everything in real time. So yeah, hopefully you guys like this slight change of pace. But yeah, as some of you know, my character's name is Heijin, and yeah, like I mentioned in the prologue, she appears to be wearing this dress, and I wanted to hammer it down before moving on to the thumbnails. And so I ran into certain problems when I was trying to figure out the preliminary stuff before doing the prologue. First of all, I'll just share some of the goals that I had set up prior to going into this type of work. So basically the first goal was to design a costume and then do a test panel. And I mentioned this now because half the video is me working on costume design and the other half will be illustrating this panel that is the thumbnail for this video. So stay tuned for that if that's what drew you in. That will be coming down the line later on in the video. I'm not really sure exactly what part of the process would be more interesting for you guys, so any sort of feedback would be totally appreciated. And by what part of the process, I mean like for me to specifically explain. In this video, I was gonna focus on talking about some of the challenges that I faced and some of the mental process that I went through, and not so much the actual execution, but we shall see how this goes. So one of the biggest challenges for this costume, and something that I was stuck on for quite some time, was the fact that the loose setting for the prologue, I mean, I don't know if this is spoiler territory, but I don't really care at this point, is early 1600s, and the comic itself and the story is sort of like fantasy. I would put it in a fantasy genre, although it's not like the Lord of the Rings or any of the really super original world building type of fantasy stories that you see nowadays. This takes place in a fictional European-esque country, and it's not super specific because the setting just honestly doesn't really matter that much. It's about a small town, and which country that town is situated in really bears no relevance to anything that actually happens, which is why I never really defined that. And so one of the issues that I had when designing the costumes for the prologue specifically was figuring out how I'm gonna approach the historical aspect of it. Like, since it's loosely based on reality, you know, in a lot of ways it's not super heavy on the fantasy aspect, and since I have a rough time period in mind, like a rough timeline, I figured I should at least do some research to see if I could make it historically accurate. And that's kind of the first thought that I had. And so, by the way, what I'm talking about does not really pertain to what I'm drawing on the screen. So if you think that this is super historically inaccurate, you're correct, because it is not. And I'm just basically expressing how I got here. And so once I did a bunch of research, I spent a couple of days looking up resources on historical fashion and just the types of garments that were prevalent in that time. And honestly, historical fashion is a huge topic, and it's so vast, and it is very difficult to dive into this thing headfirst, especially having had so little previous experience in doing this kind of research. And actually, on that note, let me take a quick minute to tell you about this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform with thousands of classes on a huge variety of artistic and creative topics that range from drawing, illustration, and animation all the way to photography, self-care, organization, and tons more. It's the perfect place for curious people who love to learn new things, and there's no shortage of interesting topics to discover when you browse the platform. I've personally been using Skillshare for years now and have gained a ton of useful knowledge that aids me in my everyday work and life. And one class that came to mind when I was making this video is that of Bernadette Banner, a class about sewing basics called Work Wonders with Fabric, Needle, and Thread. As a character designer, I think it's so important to understand garment construction, and this class is a perfect entry point to sewing. Bernadette is such a huge inspiration and an excellent teacher. I've learned a ton from her about sewing and historical fashion. You can watch this class and as many more as you can fit into a month for free by becoming a member. The first 1,000 people who use the link in my description will receive a 1-month free trial to Skillshare Premium. You can watch so many classes in a month, and I actually have one on my own on the platform as well. Highly recommend Skillshare. It's an awesome community, and you can find the link in my description below. And now, back to my visual development struggles. So I was just saying how difficult it is to dip into researching historical fashion. There's so many factors that affect what clothing was actually prevalent at the time. Specifically, the location makes a huge difference, of course, and since this takes place in a fictional, non-existent country, I even kind of got stumped on that front. I couldn't really pick a country specifically, and a lot of times when you go back and do research further down the line into like 1500s, the evidence becomes more and more scarce, so a lot of it is guesswork, and most of the stuff that's easier to find is the costumes and attire of royalty, famous people who got influential people who got their portraits painted and whatnot. And so it is quite difficult to quickly find references of what an average person may have looked like, and even peasants. Like, it's just tough to find accurate references. And so I went down this rabbit hole of trying to look up references for early 1600s attire, and you know, it does change quite a bit from decade to decade. And in the end, I felt so bogged down by this task that it made me reconsider why I'm even trying to make it historically accurate in the first place. And that is how we arrive at this drawing that you see right now, because it proved to be another swamp situation for me, just getting bogged down with doing research and figuring out what steps I want to take. I decided to just pull the plug on the research and just find something that kind of looks like that has the vibe that I'm going for. So I picked this random dress that I saw on Pinterest. It's not even a historical dress, it's some sort of historically inspired dress, as you can see. I mean, I really don't know too much about fashion history. It's something I'm very interested in, actually, and I want to learn more as time goes on, but at the moment my knowledge is very scarce in this topic. But I would say this dress is actually probably a lot more modern than what I was looking for if I wanted to have any sort of historical accuracy. But I just wanted to see what it would look like with the cinched waist, and I just jumped into this little VisDev illustration without thinking too hard about it. And I think it was a really good first step to take, because at least I broke out of the research phase and actually drew something. And I was pretty happy with how the drawing itself turned out. I think I really managed to capture my character's personality, but I did it so quickly and kind of haphazardly that I did get her proportions pretty wrong. She looks a lot taller than she's supposed to be, but I digress. In any case, this was a relatively loose sketch. I typically go a lot cleaner when it comes to visual development stuff, but it was nice to just find some sort of middle ground that doesn't take a really long time. And so I did this test drawing with the dress design that I found on Pinterest. I did change a lot of details in it, but overall the silhouette is pretty similar to what I found, and I did kind of like the vibe. I think it really captures this ghostly type of feeling that I'm going for. But in the end, I decided to backtrack and do a different version of the dress, because as some of you know, I've already mentioned earlier that I've been working on the story for such a long time, and this scene in the beginning, the first scene that will be the prologue, has been hovering in my mind for the past, I'm gonna say 12 years. I've had it, like, I came up with it around 12 years ago, which is a crazy long time ago. And I have drawn snippets of it many times before. In fact, I'll find some of them and maybe put them up on the screen here so you guys can kind of see. My art has changed quite a bit, like my style changed, but I've always consistently drawn this character with a higher waist in the dress, and that's something that I got so attached to and used to that in the end, as much as I do like this particular dress design, it just didn't feel like it was appropriate for her, the specific character. And so I decided to go back and do another version, which the video for that I don't have here. I didn't include it in this particular video. I'll most likely make a behind the scenes exclusive video on my Patreon account. If you guys haven't heard that I have started a Patreon, I'll leave a link in my description. I use it for developing my comic and share a ton of behind the scenes stuff. But anyways, yes, so I ended up settling on a different design in the end, but I just wanted to take you guys through the process that I went through before I ended up settling on a final design. I ended up basically concluding that there's no real reason for a fantasy story to aim towards historical accuracy when it comes to costumes, because at the end of the day, it bears so little relevance to the story. There are no historical figures whatsoever in my story because it is fantasy, like I mentioned, even though it's loosely based on the real world. Not really. So yeah, I'm glad that I ended up making that decision, because it can be difficult to establish a solid direction, and this is one of the issues with world building, I find, because I never noticed before that I do tend to focus a lot more on the story aspect of things than the little details, like visual details, I guess. And this is something that I'm just realizing now, and I am slightly apprehensive about the amount of work that I have to do when it comes to actual visual details of all the things that I have come up with story-wise. But you know, I'll just tackle things one thing at a time, and I will share the process with you guys. So at this point, you see I am finishing up the final touches on this design. I really like the loose approach that I took with the hair, and yeah, I really want to do stuff that's a little bit more loose going forward in the future. And so now, as you can see, I have moved on to the panel test. And the reason why I wanted to do a panel test first is because I'm still not 100% sure how I'm going to approach drawing the comic itself. I briefly mentioned in one of my recent videos that I wanted to consider doing a black and white. I'm going the black and white route, but I have since scrapped that idea, and so now I'm doing some panel tests in full color. And that is what I'm planning to do. Full color is the plan. It's gonna be difficult and time consuming, but I think it will be worthwhile because, you know, I have been waiting to start this project for so long, and I want to do it justice. I don't want to just like end up cutting corners to make it more quick or anything like that. So I also sped up the footage of this panel test, and I wanted you guys to see just how long it took me to settle on a facial expression that I like. It's actually really, really difficult to draw characters consistently, especially after I took such a long break from drawing comics. I'll quickly tell you about how my last comic drawing experience went when it came to drawing characters consistently. So it's definitely something that I found the footing for later on in the process. At first it was actually pretty difficult, but I did find that with time and having to draw the same characters like a million times over and over again, it became very, very easy to draw them accurately. And while I'm on this topic of drawing characters consistently, I actually do get that question asked quite a bit in the comment section and in my other social media. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of how I personally approach the consistency aspect of drawing characters. So for me, it's a bit of a nebulous approach that's difficult to explain and quantify in terms of actual techniques. What I end up focusing on is trying to really get a good sense of what I want the character to look like, and then based on that, everything that deviates from what the picture that I have in my mind, or the one like perfect reference that I might have of a face where I look at it and I'm like, yes, this is this character and this is what they're supposed to look like, I might use that as a single reference. But when you have when I have a very clear idea of what the character is supposed to look like, it is so easy to see any deviations from that. And that's typically just how I go about trying to fix the face of some sort of different facial expression or whatnot, like you see here, to just nudge it towards what I imagined the character to look like. I know that is probably not the best explanation, but for me personally, that is the most kind of like a surefire way to get the essence of the character down, because I have had plenty of experiences where I will just try drawing one of my characters and I can't do it. Sometimes I actually just can't do it. Like I will draw their face and it's not even necessarily a bad drawing, but there's just something about it that doesn't look like them. And sometimes I just have to move on and try again another day. I do think that warm-ups actually play quite a big role in this particular scenario, because no matter how many years I draw, no matter how often I draw, every day it's still pretty difficult to just jump straight into it successfully on a consistent basis. And I find that most of the time I do have much better results after about 30 minutes of warm-ups or so. And for warm-ups, I will typically do figure drawings, nothing too fancy, nothing that takes too long. I will typically do like 2 to 3 or maybe 5 minute tops, but yeah, around 5 minute, I guess, figure studies. Sometimes costumed, sometimes nude. It doesn't really matter. This time is just really important to warm up my hands and get me making it really changes the way that I make strokes. I don't know how to really explain it. Once in the blue moon, I can just jump straight into it and the strokes will be fine and I will get a good sketch pretty quickly. But it is kind of a rare occurrence and I tend to get much better results if I do the warm-up. So long story short, the stuff that you see right here was done without warm-ups, and I suspect that that's the reason why it took me quite a bit of time to zero in on the facial expression and the face, but I ended up getting it in the end. And moving on to the next point, one of my biggest testers for this panel was figuring out what brush I want to use to ink, because in the last couple of years, maybe in the last year or so, I've been really preferential towards this one textured brush that's quite harsh looking. And for this panel, I wanted to go back and use a brush that I used to use for inking my previous comic project, which was a graphic novel called Grimoire Noir, written by Vera Green Tea, not myself. But anyways, yes, I just want to revisit that process and see if I would actually prefer using that brush, because I did use it back then for the entirety of that whole project, and it did work quite well, and I was pretty happy with the results. But I'm still not sure if I want to use that specific brush even after doing this panel test, because one of the reasons why I'm so kind of stuck on hammering down the process first before diving into the actual pages is because it does make a huge difference in how long things take, and I have a tendency to get bogged down by details and just take a much too detailed approach, especially considering the fact that it's a comic and people don't spend that much time looking at each panel. Like, certain panels are of course more important than others, but as you can see, the time can really get increased if I use like a thinner brush to ink, or if the brush is more crisp and detail oriented, you know what I mean. Anyways, without digressing too far into the brush properties, one of the things that I found quite difficult when doing these is how to approach the hair, because my previous experience with drawing hair in comics was I would just do the line work for the whole thing and do the flats afterwards, kind of like a cell shading method. And now I'm thinking I really like this wispy look that I did in the concept art, but for some reason I have the hardest time bypassing certain steps of the process because I'm so used to line art for all my comic work and all my illustrations. I get really intimidated by not following the steps that I always follow. So in this panel, I was experimenting a bit, and I did some partially selections of the hair, just freehand lasso, as well as some different brushes that are more texture heavy, and I think I do like this type of effect a lot better than just going in and, meticulously line arting the entire thing of hair. But it's more of a loose process, and I'm not 100% sure how I can fully implement it into an easily repeatable comic page process. I hope you guys know what I mean, but this is actually a pretty big problem for me to solve. I'm thinking maybe in the future I might even just make the hair partially black, completely blacked out as a silhouette, and that might help with the process quite a bit, because since I've never done a full color comic before, I'm still not 100% sure how to properly parse out the steps that I'm gonna have to take, because I may have mentioned in one of my previous comic related videos that it's very important for me to have a very, very clear step-by-step process, especially because I tend to work in batches. So when I was working on the graphic novel from a couple of years ago, I would ink several pages at a time and then flat several pages at a time, etc. I didn't just work on one page at a time. I'm not sure how other people actually approach this. I guess it's pretty different with webtoons, but anyways, I digress. This is going to be a webcomic and it will be in print, so it's not a webtoon format. And so in order to stick with my previous assembly line type of method where I do batches of things one step at a time, I will need to properly figure out the step-by-step method. But as you can see, the process here, especially for the coloring, is very chaotic. I kept going back and changing colors of certain parts of the drawing, and yeah, that's definitely not gonna work for the comic. It needs to be settled on, it needs to be way more streamlined than this weird experimental mumbo jumbo where I just do different parts at different times and keep going back and forth. So this was a good test panel. I think I did learn a lot from it, but I think I will definitely need to do a couple more to hammer down some sort of process, and I'm even thinking of settling down on all the brushes that I like and making a separate folder for them just so they're easily accessible and I don't have to like look them up or search through all these millions of brushes that I have. As you can probably tell, I am very skittish when it comes to experimentation. I don't like it. I don't like it when things are up in the air. I need things to be very clear cut, and I need to know exactly when something is finished. So yeah, it's a bit difficult stepping back into the comic making thing, but I am extremely excited, and obviously I've been making good progress, and I guess we're coming to the end of this particular chunk of video. And yeah, I just wanted to tell you guys real quick that I am planning to do the layouts for the prologue today after I finish making this video. So yeah, good luck to me, and if you're interested in supporting this project at all, feel free to check out my Patreon in the link in my description. So I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.